Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the VAW-VRC Foundation's Oral History Project. The goal of this project is to capture and preserve stories of significant events in the VAW and VRC community's illustrious history and to make them available to the community and to the general public. I'm Joe McNamara of the VAW-VRC Foundation, and you may see my colleagues Pence Parsons and Dave Doherty, who helped produce these videos, pop up at some point during the proceedings. Today, it's my honor to introduce Captain Ralph Zia, United States Navy retired. Skipper Zia is going to describe the pivotal role he and his VAW-125 crew played in the successful intercept of the hijackers of the cruise ship Achille Lauro on October 10, 1985. A short bio: Ralph Zia is from Chicago and entered AOCS in February of 1969. He received his Naval Flight Officer Wings of Gold in April of 1970. His first assignment was in VAW-124 aboard USS America. During that tour, he deployed twice to Vietnam. He continued his progress in the VAW community, serving as operations officer at VAW-120 and VAW-122, then executive officer and commanding officer of VAW-125. In addition to challenging shore tours at OPNAV and Atlantic Command, he continued to fill significant operational billets in the Navy, including tours as the commanding officer of USS Iwo Jima and USS Saipan. Ralph, we're really looking forward to hearing your story today. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Joe. And thanks to the VAW-VRC Foundation for this entire effort in documenting these oral histories. The incident I'd like to discuss today is the intercept and forced landing of an Egyptair 737 carrying the Achille Lauro hijackers. This happened on October 10th, 1985. I was the CEO of VAW-125, part of Air Wing 17, embarked on USS Saratoga. We were in the central Mediterranean, having just completed a NATO exercise. The Saratoga commanding officer, just for information, was Captain Jerry Unruh. The embarked flag was Admiral David Jeremiah, crew Des Group 12. Well respected. Of course, he's a quote black shoe admiral, but well respected with the air wing. Attended forecastle follies, was really into it, and was a superb leader. He was our admiral. CAG was Commander Bob Brodsky. And I want to mention the CIC officer at the time, Fighter Rio Commander Sam Montgomery. We were in alert 60 status en route to Dubrovnik, the old Yugoslavia, for a port call the next day. We had been put in alert 60 status, which, as I recall, was probably a first in the Mediterranean ever being put in alert 60. We were doing maintenance and doing our thing. We were also planning and executing or having a memorial service for a naval flight officer who had been killed in a car accident while being a representative in Italy for this NATO exercise. That was taking place around 1800, 6 p.m. Quite a good turnout by the Air Wing and Ships Company for this memorial service for an outstanding naval flight officer in our squadron. When this finished, I remarked that I was kind of surprised that Admiral Jeremiah hadn't attended, or many people from his staff, which was highly unusual. He like I said, he was really into being part of, associating with the Air Wing and being part of it. As we were finishing up the memorial service, we here over the 1MC launched the alert CAPT and E2. That really had a startling effect on us because we were just ready to have a little bit of a wake back in the ready room. We proceeded back to the ready room trying to figure out what was going on. Now, let me give you a little background on what was happening a few days prior to this October 10th 1MC announcement. The Achille Lauro was an Italian cruise ship that had docked in Alexandria, Egypt, It disembarked a number of the passengers for a land tour. The ship was taking leave and was going to proceed to Port Said to pick up those passengers when they were finished with their tour. The next day, the ship was hijacked by 4 Palestinian Liberation Front terrorists. They were trying to get docking of the ship in Syria to try and force Israel into releasing some of their compatriots. They were denied initially landing privileges in Syria. They became upset and wound up killing a Jewish American citizen on board with his wife. They killed him. He was a disabled elderly person, threw him overboard and trying to shock and get somebody to let him get into Syria. That did not happen. The knowledge that they had killed that passenger, Mr. Klinghoffer, was not passed on to anybody. In fact, when the captain of the ship was talking to authorities, it was at gunpoint and said everybody was fine. The ship docked. There was a lot of diplomatic effort going on, trying to figure out, number one, where the ship was and what was going to happen with the people that the terrorists had hijacked the ship. The ship was promised safe, the terrorists were promised safe passage out of Egypt. They were allowed to dock in Port Said. A lot of diplomatic things were happening there with diplomatic representatives. They finally found out they had killed Mr. Klinghoffer. The terrorists were already off the ship. The president of Egypt said that they had been safely transported out of the country. This, as it turns out, was not true. Through intelligence sources, they found out that they were still in country and they were going to depart on the 10th to be flown out to Tunisia. This is where we pick it up again. Again, the intel back in DC and the discussions that were going on in the White House were dramatic, I guess. Reading some of the history that happened, one of the people in the Situation Room, Captain Stark, suggested that perhaps perhaps the U.S. could intercept the airliner and do a Yakamoto, I guess, the Japanese, where they intercepted and killed shot down the plane. There was no indication that anybody was going to shoot down anybody, but that was being worked on. That plan was presented to the president. He okayed it, the intercept of the 737. Of course, nobody knew when it was going to take off and what was going on. Certainly nobody in the air wing was acknowledging this. As we turned out, the Admiral Jeremiah was busy talking to Sixth Fleet and higher authority, getting the sporadic information on what was happening. They finally gave the word and execute to launch aircraft. They were very concerned of where the ship was at the time and time distance issues on what the chances are on intercepting this aircraft, because nobody exactly knew what the timeline was for the flight and when it was departing Egypt. The first planes were launched in less than 30 minutes. The fighters in the first E-2 were launched and they proceeded southwest to Tunis and trying to work backwards, trying to intercept airliners en route to Tunis. Intel was refined. I went over to combat. I'm still in my whites, having just come from this memorial service, trying to figure out what was going on. I met with CAG and Sam Montgomery, the CIC officer, and I think Admiral Jeremiah even popped in there, and we're all trying to figure out what's going on and what to do next. This information was all being transferred by radio to the E-2 that was airborne, and of course it was proceeding southwest. let me share with you. This is a map of the Ionian Sea, the Central Mediterranean, depicting where the carrier was heading towards Dubrovnik, sort of north there between Italy and Greece. The dashed line is the predictor of what we thought was the flight to Tunis, and it's pretty much an airway proceeding that direction. The word that we received is if we could intercept and determine where this plane was, they would like to get it force landed to Sigonella, Sicily. Based on the refined information and the fact that the fighters and E2 were heading southwest towards south of Sigonella, and the timeline and what was eventually refined that the plane hadn't taken off yet, it was determined to launch another set of CAPT fighters and another E2. I talked to CAG, and CAG strongly suggested I get in the next airplane to go up, because I had basically more info than the airborne airplane. So we put the crew together, which included Lieutenant Commander Terry Dudash as a pilot, Lieutenant Kent Schultz as a co-pilot, and in the back with me was Lieutenant Ron Ziemko and Lieutenant Mike Mulligan. We all briefed up, took off around 21:15, 9:15 in the evening, and proceeded to the southeast of the ship, intercepting aircraft as we went along, proceeding to station. We intercepted about 4 different airliners. One section of transport aircraft was intercepted by the one of our CAP. Determined it was a flight of 2 U.S. transport aircraft with their lights off. Now, we didn't know what they were. Well, we knew they were U.S. transport aircraft, didn't know what they were doing there, and didn't know why they were flying around with their lights off. We reported this back to the ship and were immediately told to disregard and proceed southeast towards the intersection just south of Crete, where I have that little X with a down south of Crete. We continued to do intercepts. We were listening to airways communications, and I can tell you, if we had 10 radios in that aircraft, it wouldn't have been enough. We also, at the time, had the only aircraft airborne with a VHF frequency capability. Of course, the airliners were all using VHF communications. Our fighters and tankers all were using, of course, UHF communications. We listened to airways communications and listened to HF radio communications, and learned that the airliner was reporting his approach to the Paleohora intersection, which is basically, like I said, south of Crete, about 30 miles south of Crete. We took the fighters approached the airliner finally, snuck up on them. They got close enough, and I'm saying real close, that the Rio and the first fighter turned his flashlight on to identify the tail number on the aircraft. And it was the one we were looking for. As we reported this back to the ship, they confirmed it. And they said, flight follow. The airliner had been denied, we learned, landing rights at Tunis. He tried to get permission to land in Athens. That was denied. And then we learned that he was going to go back, had been approved to go back and land back in Cairo, return back to Egypt. We reported all this back to the ship, and the ship said, communicate with them and determine, first establish communications with the airliner, and then see if he won't follow us to Sigonella, Sicily, and force land him at Sigonella, which is just to the west of Catania, Sicily. We did that. We made a couple of communications. He wouldn't respond, and then we got a little more forceful. Let me play a little bit of that.
Yes, you are ordered to proceed direct to Sigonella, Sicily. You are being escorted by 2 interceptor aircraft. Vector 280 for Sigonella, Sicily, over. The center for proceed heading 40. 280 to Sigonella, Sicily. 280, you're to land immediately at Sigonella, Sicily, over. What's my disposition, can you say again? You are to turn immediately to 280, heading 280 immediately.
That's a little bit of the communications to get him stimulated to fly to Sigonella, Sicily. We continued, of course, the fighters were tucked in real close. They were lights out. They couldn't see the fighters. Eventually, we had because he didn't look like he was taking the heading that we'd given him, had him turn their lights on, which really got their attention because they were tucked in so close. He was a little concerned and turned his landing lights on. We had, of course, the fighters couldn't communicate verbally with, everything was going through me. So I had the guy shut his landing lights off, which was interfering with the fighters' ability to stay close. And then once they all rushed to the window to see what was going on, they said the fighters were too close. So we had them back off a little bit. And eventually he got headed 280 or to the south, to the west, heading towards Sigonella. Now, once we determined that, of course, E2 being a lot slower than these airliners, we knew they were going to pass us at some point. So Terry firewalled the E2, so we would stay within radio communications as they passed us. Eventually, it was about 400 miles from where they were to Sigonella, and we wanted to maintain those communications with our fighters and with the obviously the Egyptair aircraft. That proceeded on along smoothly. We had another section of fighters join up with them, so we had about 4 fighters escorting him, and then the real fun began, trying to get him clearance to land at Sigonella. The fighters checked in with approach control, trying to get clearance. The diplomatic things were happening. The president of Italy apparently okayed it. That word never got down to Sigonella or the approach control that this was being permitted to land in Sicily. So the initial response was, no, you can't land at Sicily. So the fighters on the UHF declared an emergency. I told the airliner pilot to declare an emergency. Finally, a U.S. representative in the tower approved it for landing at Sigonella. I guess the pilot the airliner was a tad nervous. Was a little hot on the approach. He was fast and high. Had to do a missed approach with 4 fighters escorting him over the airfield. So he came around, eventually landed. Those 2 transport aircraft we had intercepted a while back, as it turns out, were loaded with Delta Force and SEALs. They landed right behind it, blocked the runway, disembarked the Delta and the SEAL teams. course, we're still flying, trying to figure out, you know, what else we can do. The fighters were overhead. I believe the tarp, one of the fighters was tarps, and they actually got a good shot of everybody. The next thing that happened, of course, 300 Italian Army people surrounded the Delta and the SEALs, and that was the commencement of a standoff that goes well beyond the scope of this briefing, because historically, I'll tell you, there's a fantastic publication if you want to get all the background on what happened, the diplomatic things that were going on, and eventually what happened to the terrorists. In fact, let me show that to you now. It's a book by a retired Navy Captain Mike Bond called The Achille Lauro Hijacking. He was an intelligence officer in the Situation Room in the White House. He did this book, I think it was in 2004, and goes into great detail on how this all transpired and what eventually happened. I mean, there were movies made, there was an opera apparently made, and musicals made of this, but there's a lot of after action things that happened, and he goes into great deal. If you're interested, that's a superb book to read. So what happens next? The next thing we hear, of course, there's no more radio communications. They're on deck. There's a standoff going on between the Italian Army and the U.S. Special Forces as they try and negotiate apparently with what's going to happen with these hijackers. And then the next thing we know, the radio channels on both tower and ground at Sigonella are being jammed. So we figure that's time to go home. Our job is done. Now it's a matter of getting all these fighters refueled and getting ourselves back on deck. En route, of course, Ron and Mike in the back are doing a lot of great work on getting these fighters refueled, because it was a couple 100-mile tour, a trek back to the Sarah. Sarah headed south to sort of meet us. We put the tankers in a position to pick them up right when they became feet wet, and they would fly along with them, tanking en route. We landed about a little after 1 o'clock in the morning, back on the Sarah. I think during the flight en route, I mentioned to Mike and Ron in the back as we're motoring ahead or getting ready to land, I said, you know, I don't think this has ever happened before. It'll probably make the news. Probably the most understatement of the year. We landed, debriefed, and then I got a call from the flag spaces. They said Admiral Jeremiah wants to talk to you guys. And I said, okay. We were headed for a cheeseburger down the sandwich line. We were hoping. But anyway, we said, let's go see Admiral Jeremiah. So he was in his flag cabin, beautiful cabin with a nice plush beige carpet. And I think I was the first one in there. And I walked up, he told me, have a seat. I looked around, I think I saw Mike and Ron, they were heading in there. I looked on the floor, and I had put footprints, greasy footprints from the flight deck all over his beautiful carpet. And I apologized profusely. He didn't want to hear it. He was so happy he could. He said, don't worry about that. He says, do you have a cigarette? At the time, I did have a pack of cigarettes. I don't think he ever smoked before. He was happy. Accolades were coming in already. Again, this is about a little between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning, probably about 7 or 8 o'clock back in the States. There were all sorts of messages he was receiving, congratulating him and the ship and the air wing for the job that just happened. Of course, we were all tired, we were hungry, and just happy to be there and having done it. That was it for that evening. We were still pretty pepped up. And again, the next day, the Admiral called me down to flag spaces and with a couple of the fighter crew to be there when President Reagan called to congratulate the ship, the staff, and the air wing on a job well done. That was pretty exciting. And then still following that, we got a call to join some of the fighter guys with Admiral Jeremiah. We did fly to London. There was supposed to be an international press briefing on the incident. on the 14th of October. We landed in London on the 13th, went out to dinner, came back. We had written up statements we were going to read at the press conference. Late at night, I'm calling my wife, just checking in to see what was going on back stateside. And she was saying it was enormous. She was getting calls from everybody. The Admiral's wife, I find out, was getting calls from everybody. They had interviewed my brother in Chicago and my father-in-law. It made the local news. I don't know what they were talking about, but so we knew there was a lot of excitement and interest. They handed us a PAO publication with all the things the embassy in London did. And it was about an inch thick with all the newspaper clippings and excitement over capturing the hijackers. As I was talking to my wife, we got the word that the news conference had been canceled the next day. We were to leave London and fly back to Sigonella. We spent the night in Sigonella. We're invited to dinner by the CO and the XO of the base. They were having a dinner with the P3 squadron, and the CO of the base sort of told us what happened, because he got involved. Him and the XO base got involved, got called from the racquetball court, and sort of involved in the negotiations between General Steiner, who was in charge of the special forces, and the Italian army, sort of defusing that whole situation. And it was interesting. He said the next day, on the 11th, the morning, wound up the Italians took custody of the hijackers. We're flying them to Rome. The Navy, U.S. wanted to have that flight followed to ensure it was going, I guess, to Rome. So they had a T-39 full of folks going to just sort of chase that flight. The Italians would not allow the T-39 to take off, so the T-39 took off on the taxiway, which again stimulated the Italians, I guess, because they launched 2 interceptors to intercept the T-39, but they all finally flew to Rome. So that was our operation. It was relatively short. It was sort of bread and butter for the E2 guys. That's our bread and butter, learning how to control cap and intercept airplanes. It's just really a basic instruction for us, but doing it with no information or little information, and then forcing an airliner to land, that was a new one. It was interesting. It was what I called a night to remember for the E2 community, and certainly for VAW-125 in the Saratoga. So that was the incident in a nutshell. If you have any questions, I want to thank everybody at the VAW-VRC Foundation for this effort in getting these oral histories. I think it's really important. The Hawkeye history and community has got a great history, and I'm glad it's being documented. Thanks again.
So Ralph, a couple questions that I had.
Sure.
When your conversations with the pilot, initially he was like, "Who is this, and what are you trying to tell me to do?" Is that the sense that you had?
Absolutely. He didn't know. He didn't know what a tiger tail was, and I'm sure he was working radios as hard as we were working radios. He was being denied all these various airports that he thought he was going to be able to land with the hijackers. So when I jumped in there, in fact, I think Muggs or Ron initially tried to get a hold of him, and then I tried 2 or 3 call-ups using the call sign Tiger Tail. He didn't know what that was, and I don't blame him. But he finally did answer up, and I'm sure concurrently they were trying to call all these different places to try and get landing clearance, and they were not getting any information. So I'm sure he was under a lot of pressure from the embarked terrorists and their entourage and trying to find a place to go. And again, thankfully, he answered up and excuse me, and take some direction. And I think once the fighters turned their lights on, he knew it was serious.
You know, was there anyone else on the aircraft except the tourists and the flight crew, or we weren't regular passengers, were there? Or?
No, no, no. As far as I know, they had some security people there. There was the terrorists. They were joined by I can't recall the guy's name now. One of the head people in the Palestinian Liberation Front joined them in that flight. He was one of the higher ups. And I think there were some Egyptian diplomats on board too.
Yeah.
Again, I refer to Mike Bond's book on the excellent history. I think he goes into a lot of that in great detail.
Again, this is something you were not on that airplane, but the terrorists did not try to prevent them from landing or, prevent
No.
the.
To my knowledge, no. It was all up to the pilots. I think they knew that, I'm not sure if anybody was armed in that, in that aircraft. They knew they had to land somewhere, and we weren't going to allow them to land back in Cairo.
I think Pence has a question. Pence, go ahead.
Yes, Ralph, do you know who actually captured the terrorists when they landed at SIG?
That's it. I think eventually it was negotiated that the Italians would take them into custody.
Thank you.
And then
It wound up being that flight to Rome. And then there's great detail in Mike Bond's book on all the trials, tribulations, and in court appearances, I guess, by these terrorists. The U.S. wanted to take charge of it, and because of all the diplomatic issues going on behind the scenes, I think because it was Italian territory, it was decided the Italians would take charge.
Ralph, you talked about how the mission itself was a fairly standard one for E-2s and F-14s, conducting intercepts and refueling. But what was the atmosphere in the airplane? Were you guys, calm and collected, or was it one-arm paper hanger? What was the feeling like in the back?
Well, it was. You're right. I mean, like I said, it's sort of basic bread and butter intercept control and tanker control, and the energy level went up because we knew this was high vis. The radios, like I said, I could use 10 more radios, never stopped. I mean, I was talking to Sam Montgomery in CIC, and I know Keg, I'm sure, was down there, and I'm sure the Admiral was down there, all getting information to and from the E-2 to the ship, trying to determine what to do next, what was happening. They were all apprehensive that we would find the right airliner. So I'm sure the energy level was real high. In the back end, we were just like busy, just busy talk. The front end, they were busy. They were monitoring the radios, helping us in the back, because, like I said, radio transmissions were going. You couldn't answer the phone fast enough. And the one thing is, our system was just working perfectly. Everything, the tactical data system was working great. The navigation was great. The pilots kept great updated navigation, so we had a great picture back there. And luckily, it was kind of, as I recall, a pretty dark night, because obviously they couldn't see the airliners with the lights off, sitting right on top of them. And like I said, it became frantic, and certainly the pucker factor went real high when we were told, start communicating and tell this guy, we're going to fly him, escort him to Sigonella. What if he hadn't followed the directions? Well, that's it. Would we have fired tracers? The fighters had been all uploaded with tracers and stuff. None of that was discussed. Would that have happened? Would we have allowed him to go back to Cairo? That's all speculation. I think the fact that we had a lot of fighters sitting right close to him, they got the message fast and clear.
One more question. I know this is so interesting, but if you were talking to a young NFO or pilot in an E2 today, what were the lessons learned, or what would be the things you would say about how you were able to be prepared for that unique, extraordinary mission?
Well, the best way to prepare is continue to train, continue to discuss, have good crew coordination, know what the guy on the left and right is, and the guys on the front end, because you know it all came together. We all worked together, training. And when they said go, it was just pure basic training that took over. Of course, the excitement level and the like I said, the pucker factor went up when we were told to intercept and force land an airliner, which doesn't happen too often. And it certainly hadn't happened in my lifetime. So it like I said, real interesting, but I tell you, it was, you wouldn't think just having a bunch of CAPT and tankers and intercepting airliner one after the other would be busy, but it was all the behind the scenes, people wanting to be updated and updating us on certain intel things that we're getting on a minute by minute basis. It was fun, interesting, and a fast 4 or 5 hours in the airplane.
I think Pence has another question. Go ahead, Pence.
Yes, can you share a picture of the Achille Lauro?
You know what? I think I forgot to do that, didn't I? I got so wrapped up in myself here. Let's see.
While we're waiting, there was an opera. John Adams, a great American composer, did an opera called The Death of Klinghoffer based on this incident.
You see it now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, that's the Achille Lauro. Like I said, about 600, a little over 600-foot cruise liner. Had quite a reputation for having problems, I guess, and eventually it caught on fire and sank in, I believe it was 1994, 1995. I don't know if I mentioned this, but later that month, I think we went into Naples, Italy, and it just so happened she was tied up right there at the landing at the dock. So it was kind of interesting. We didn't share any stories with it.
Ralph, I just want to say, appreciate what you're saying about the fact that we're trying to capture some of these stories, but this is one of the greatest. So really appreciate you sitting down with us and telling us this story, because
I'll tell you, it's my pleasure, and look forward to listening to some of the other stories you guys are recording.
thanks. Great job, Ralph. And thank you for all you did and continue to do for our country.
Thank you very much.